Thank you all for joining us today. I'm very excited to be able to present this to all of you because, and the reason you're listening to me right now is because I want to make it clear, I'm not a clinician, I'm not a doctor, I'm not, someone who has a clinical background. My background professionally is actually in marketing and branding. And so, which actually comes in handy in a lot of ways, but my real credentials around talking about trauma and what it means to have trauma in your life and how to get from trauma to thriving comes from my life experience. I am what I call a thriver, and it was an interesting road to get to this place. And I'll explain, some of the science behind it, some of the personal stories behind it here today. But the bottom line is I really firmly believe, as a patient advocate and someone who has been through multiple systems throughout my life, that we really need to start shifting the conversation. It's time to start moving away from the idea of trauma-informed and building resilience, and really look at what are the action steps we need to get people to thriving. And the reason I say that is because I look at, what's going on right now with addiction, not just opioids, but addiction in general skyrocketing. We have depression, anxiety, higher rates of diagnosis than ever before. We have more people medicated for mental health reasons than ever before. And really the biggest marker, in my mind about all of this is the suicide rate is also exploding at a rate that it's never done before. And all of this is causing life expectancy to go down. And when we dig into, some of the things that are making that happen, the core issues around that do go back to this concept of developmental trauma. And so that's what we're really going to be talking about here today is how do we start to shift the conversation from talking about trauma and how to, educate. It's not that those things aren't still important, but it's also now time to look at how do we get the people who are dealing with these issues to a place of thriving, not just surviving, not just, dealing with the acute issues that are in front of them, but how do we get them past and engaging in life? You can see here, this first slide is a picture of two different me's, really, and one is a traumatized human being who, and yes, that's my mugshot, but I was going, even in that mugshot at that time, I did have a six-figure job, and I had a house in Eden Prairie, a wife, a child, a dog, 2 cars, and that still, I still wasn't able to handle any of those things. And I think that really is the difference between traumatized Tyler and thriving Tyler today is I have a lot of similar things. In fact, I make less money than I did back then, but I actually engage in life. I actually am part of and authentically am a part of loving real relationships in my life. And as we're going to start to dig into this, we'll find out why that's important. So for me, switching the conversation from the victim survivor to thriver mentality is very, very important because I was a victim when I was being abused as a child. I was a victim when the school system reinforced that I was just another poor white trash kid in class. But I also survived all those things. I survived those things and showed real resilience in doing that. I was a survivor and showed resilience when I was drinking myself to death at many points, which we'll get into in a little more detail. But what really stands out to me now is how different I live now because of the ability to thrive. And what has gotten me there is really this, is actually having healthy, supportive relationships in my life. As we're going to find out, I'll even give you the secret to the end, it's all about relationships. It's all about how do we literally build healthy relationships and connect with others, because it is a biological need that we have. We are going to talk about the difference between PTSD and event trauma and developmental trauma. I've been diagnosed with PTSD. I've also been diagnosed with learning disorders, depression, anxiety, substance use disorder, all of those things. And I've been treated for all of those things. I've been given, in some cases, medication for those things. It wasn't until the developmental trauma, the concept was introduced to me and then was treated, where I started to feel like I actually was thriving in life. And to give you a quick kind of idea of what the difference is, when I was 11 years old, I was sleeping in my bed, and in a dead sleep at about 3 o'clock in the morning, all of a sudden I felt this pressure on my ankle, and the next thing I knew, I was being dragged off my bed and across the floor to the staircase. And I remember the staircase very specifically because as my face hit the first stair, I quickly put my hands out and was able to use my hands to walk down the staircase. And as I got down to the bottom of the staircase and dragged across the floor, I realized that my stepfather he'd come home from his second shift at work, and he was obviously very angry about something, and grabbed me by the back of the neck and held me up over the kitchen sink as he dragged me into the kitchen, held me up over the kitchen sink, and made me redo the dishes that I had already done that night because they weren't done well enough. And that was a really, and there were a lot of events like that for me in early childhood, and we'll get a little more into the background of that. But that particular event had all the classic PTSD signs around it, and I was treated accordingly. I had nightmares, disassociation, flashbacks, all kind of tied to this event and other events like that from my childhood. And I got EMDR therapy. I did some other therapies around that helped me deal with and process that event that was really stuck, a stuck memory for me. The difference between that and what was more insidious and what actually led me more to the suicidal parts of my life were the developmental trauma, or the systems of traumatic events that led up to and follow an event like that. I'm a child whose biological parents were divorced when I was 2 years old in the mid-70s. So yes, I'm in my 40s. And my parents would have today been considered a high conflict divorce, although back then it was just divorce. And also back then the child went with the mother. There was really no question about that. And so I went with my mother, who had definitely some sort of undiagnosed mental illness, and that played out as she really took it very, very personally. And yes, it is personal, but my father left her. And when he left her, that instantly transformed our relationship into, I am now a weapon for her to use against my father, to get back at him for hurting her. And because of her mental state, she was not very good at processing many things, and she was actually unable to see how she had ever done anything wrong, or what her side of the street needed to be cleaned. She never really thought in those terms. It was always somebody else's fault, and that leads to a lot of manipulation, a lot of lying. My dad was this horrible person. That's what I was kind of built up and told. Even though I did see him regularly, it made it very, very difficult for me to connect with either of my biological parents. And then you take the fact that she then got married at a very quickly after that divorce to a man who just graduated high school. She herself had only had a high school education, and they proceeded to have 7 more children. And so without going back to school, without getting anything more than a high school education. So, that kind of leads to this system that would allow for abuse like that to happen. It wasn't just about the event. It wasn't just about being terrorized in that moment. There was a system of abuse and neglect that was involved in that household that had a lot more microaggressions and smaller traumas that kind of led up to a way of thinking and a way of looking at the world. Because when you're a child, that other slide shows, when you're a child and you come into this world, any little thing, like even just a slight breeze, is literally the most discomfort you have ever faced in your life. It is the worst experience you've ever had. And so when you actually have really horrible experiences and neglect, those things, especially if they are repeated over and over again, they compound. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today, is the difference between, or really how developmental trauma shapes our minds and how it really forms our brain development and how that really translates into our relationships. Why is this important? Because trauma it's ubiquitous. It's all over the place. Over 2/3 of our population, general population, have experienced at least one childhood or adverse childhood experience. In people of color, that is more likely to be 83%. That's a lot of our, that's obviously a majority of our population has experienced trauma of some sort at some point in time. And for me, and for the sake of this discussion, we're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences and what they are. But really, in my mind, and as someone who's experienced 8, who's got an ACE score of 8, we'll talk a little more about what that means. That really is more about how did adverse childhood experiences disrupt my attachment that then disrupted my ability or my brain's ability to develop properly. And so we're going to really look at some of the science behind brain development, how that plays out with adverse childhood experiences, and really then try to connect with the human side of it. Because one of the, like I said, my background's in marketing, and so I've looked at this field very intensely over the last few years. And one of the things I can tell you is that there's a huge disconnect being done out there with the system of care that we have and the people who need it. And one of the biggest problems we have is that we aren't looking at each other as human beings. We tend to dehumanize each other without trying to, and even under the best of intentions, we tend to dehumanize each other, and it's actually a way to feel comfortable. And sometimes we need to sit in that discomfort and be able to move through that. So we're going to talk a little bit about, not only how does adverse childhood experiences play out in brain development, but also how that looks in ourselves, how we can look into ourselves and become more aware of how this is affecting us, our relationships, and especially the relationships with people we're trying to support. So, here we have a pretty typical emotional brain, and how that works is you get something that comes in through your senses, usually, and in this case it's showing the eye, but something comes in through your senses, and if you notice, it goes through your feeling or limbic system part of the brain first. And the reason it does that is to find out or to assess and appraise the situation to see if this is something that you need to be, if you need to be extremely worried about, if your life is being threatened. So right away, there's an assessment process, an appraisal process that happens. Then it goes to the prefrontal cortex where you do your thinking and your reasoning, and then you come up with, how am I going to react to this thing that's stimulating my senses? How am I going to tell my body to react to this thing? And then the response is sent out to the entire body. This is important because this is how the brain works and how it develops. And if you know anything about early childhood development, from 0 to 3 or 4 or really 5, the prefrontal cortex isn't even online yet. So you're starting to develop how you're going to interact with the world before your brain is fully developed. And that becomes important for many, many reasons, but most of all for our learned experiences. We use experiences to not only learn externally, but also internally, and how to prepare our entire bodies to handle things. So when that response goes out, it goes out through the entire nervous system. So it goes out to our entire body. Our whole body takes in and remembers a response to something. And if the event is strong enough, it is something that we will hold. Like my wife will tell you that, waking me up in the middle of the night on a dead sleep is not a fun thing to do, because I jump up like my life is in danger, and my whole body reacts that way. It's not just in my mind or between my ears. I literally jump up and jump and react. So that's what we're talking about here. And this happens because the brain, this is a neuron, and it's actually a neuron and a neural pathway to another neuron. So it's showing the connection. The reason this is important is because this is how the brain takes those interpretations and then uses them to develop pathways of sending messages so that we can send our body the proper way to react to a situation. And when you are a newborn, going back to that other slide that shows the baby who is literally having the worst moment of its life because it is chilled, that's because it doesn't have a whole lot of experience to build on. And that's literally a neural pathway problem in the brain. So if you look at a newborn, they don't have a whole lot of neural pathways for them to work with. So their responses are going to be pretty limited. They're going to really be able to only see everything as a threat until they are externally comforted and made to feel like, this isn't a threat and they're okay. So if you look from 0 to 24 months, they start to build neural pathways, and there's quite a bit there. And remember, these neural pathways are all being built before the prefrontal cortex is officially online. If you take that out over years, you look at, at birth, you don't have very many neural pathways to work with, but that changes dramatically, especially once the prefrontal cortex comes online and you start then building lots of different highways of information. The ones that are used the most get the deepest grooves. The ones that are used the most also then at puberty are the ones that stick around. The ones that are used the least are what get dropped at puberty. So if you look at the 14-year-olds, neurons and neural pathways, they're a lot less than the 6-year-olds. That's because and I've got a 3-year-old and a 14-year-old, and I can tell you that both of these look very real to me. The 14-year-old it's not that he has lost his brain or memory, but it's just that he's back to developing the same way that he was back when he was an infant. And so he's building out neural pathways. However, he's also got a structure that's already in place of deeper neural pathways of a system of life that has repeated itself over and over in his childhood. And those are the deeper neural pathways that will build the foundation for how he goes forward and views the world in life. The reason this is very important, if you haven't guessed already, is that if you are a child and your needs do not get met, you tend to look at the world in a very negative light, because getting your needs met is not only important for basic survival, but it literally builds how your brain develops. And if a baby has a need, the baby cries, the need is not met by the caregiver, mistrust develops. And it's not just mistrust. I would take it a step further and say that there's safety. If they can't if they can't trust their surroundings, they do not feel safe. And so they're starting to build the idea that the world is not safe for them. The Lucas phone factor that I refer to on this slide actually is something that I refer to when my youngest son, the 3-year-old that I referred to, he was born a month premature. And so my wife and I had to take turns on a regular basis to feed him every 3 hours. And after the first couple of nights, I started to notice that every time I started to feed him, and I would cuddle him close and I would feed him with the bottle, but every time I started to feed him and I started to read an article on my phone to stay awake or something on my phone, he started crying and fussing. And like I said, it took me a couple nights to really figure out that every time I put my phone down and then looked at him in the eye, he then calmed down and was able, and he started to eat and he felt better. And the reason for that is he needed my eye contact to know that not only was I holding him, not only was I feeding him, but I was present there with him. And that made him feel safe. And it was like clockwork. Every time I would pick up that phone, he would start to fuss. As soon as I put it down and I held him, he felt safe. That's important. That means that just looking him in the eye, just doing that one little act, that is an important piece of brain development for that child. And it's also an important piece to how he is starting to build those neural pathways to build the world, to how he views the world. And really, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about ACEs, is we're talking about what are the things that are interrupting that child's ability to feel basically a matter of abundance versus a matter of scarcity. If the child's needs are not being met, they tend to feel like the world is not enough for them, it's scarce, and that's when the safety feels more threatening to them. And ACEs are really what are identified as the things that get in the way. And so this is a study that was done by two fellows, Robert Anda and Vincent Fleety. And this slide is part of Robert Anda's ACE interface training, which I have been trained to present in. But this is a study that was done by these two gentlemen to look at and find out what is the relationship between childhood adversity and health issues. And they took a pretty huge sampling of 17,000 people, mostly white, mostly upper or middle to upper middle class folks who were supposed to be kind of in the more healthy, in the most healthy category. And what they found was that actually the childhood adversities that they went through, they were common even with this population, and that they were really directly related to health issues. And so if you look at what those childhood adversity points are, they're really just 10 points that deal with 3 different categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. I've mentioned before I'm an 8 out of all of those. And so, typically that means that I am going to have issues or many health problems. Usually once you hit 4 or more, the health problems increase dramatically. And so if you just kind of look through here in Minnesota, we have, this data is from 2011. I'm waiting to get some more updated stuff on this, but these are the percentages per childhood adversity experience of how many people in our gender population have experienced these particular things. And if you notice, some of these things can really bleed together pretty quickly and easily. Like, for instance, drug use in the household also usually leads to domestic violence, which also usually means physical abuse. Those things can lead to separation or divorce. So these things can pile up quickly. There we go. So as you can see here, I'm just going to go back here quick. This is this is an issue that is not only one that affects, this issue affects a lot of people, is what I'm trying to say. And if you notice, they only go up to, they have 36% have 0, 26% have 1, 16% have 2 or more. This is 1 or more, or 1, have 2, have 3. So each one of the ACEs is its own score. And so if you have, like I said, I'm 8 out of 10. So if you have 1, you're in the 26% category and so on. The reason they stop at 4 is because after 4 or more, it just continues to really, really go up. I mean, it's the tipping point for when adverse childhood experiences really start to affect your health. It doesn't wait until like 8 or 9. It starts to really hit at 4. In fact, people who have 4 or more ACEs tend to have a life expectancy of 20 years less than the average for the general population. And here are some of the health problems associated with adverse childhood experiences, and then the percentage of people who have those health problems that also have experienced childhood adversity. And so as you can see, these percentages are very high, and high enough to correlate that they actually do have a lot to do with the health problems of someone. And so I'm going to use this particular slides to kind of go through this information and really to tell 2 quick stories around this, because this is a more important slide than just the COPD. So when you're talking about 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, the more adverse childhood experiences you have, the more likely you are to start smoking by the age of 14. Also, the more likely you are to develop COPD. What that doesn't just mean that you're more likely to smoke. That also talks about brain regulation. So we go back to the initial slides that we had been talking about, and adverse childhood experiences interrupt some of those attachments, and those attachments get interrupted, and that actually interrupts our ability to regulate. As I told you before, with my son, looking him in the eye was a helpful regulator to help him feel safe. So when you have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, that means you have grown up in a system that has not been able to meet your needs, and therefore your emotional safety becomes paramount. It becomes more important than your physical safety. And if you look at this, people will smoke themselves into COPD and then continue smoking even after they have COPD, if they know they have the problem, not just because they're addicted to nicotine, but it's also because it helps them regulate their thinking and physically regulate their body. That's really what we're talking about here in the difference between typical brain development and developmental trauma. Because basically in typical brain development, cognition becomes the primary way that we kind of whip through this part of the, we whip through the initial kind of interpretation part of the brain really quickly, because the world hasn't been that scary, it hasn't been that unsafe, so we're able to discern really quickly into the cognitive part of the brain. How do we then need to regulate? How do we then need to respond? In someone who's experienced developmental trauma, it's just the opposite. We don't very quickly move to cognition. In fact, we barely get there, and we spend a lot more time in flight, fight, freeze, and much more of the world is a scary, hard to adjust to place. And so therefore regulation becomes very, very important to us, because it's the one thing that makes us feel safe, because the world is just not. And so regulation becomes important to the fact that it's more important than our physical safety. And I can speak to that as someone who's been diagnosed with substance use disorder. I can tell you right now that drinking became more important to me than my physical safety, because drinking was a way I could regulate. I literally spent 6 days in the hospital at one point with liver and pancreas issues. With every intention to quit drinking, I was told by doctors, you cannot drink anymore, you have to stop. I said, I know, I agree with you, and I'm going to. And as I was leaving that hospital, I remember high-fiving one of the nurses and saying, yep, I'm done, this is it, I'm changing everything. And I had every intention of doing that. Once I got into the cab to go home, my mind was off, and I could not, all of a sudden, anxiety kept creeping in. I kept thinking about, oh my God, I'm going to have to go home by myself. And my emotional state went into flight, fight, and freeze. The only way I knew how to regulate was to go and get drunk, and that's what I did. I literally had the cab driver stop at a liquor store on my way home from the hospital, and I was back in the hospital less than a week later. And that just showed, like, it wasn't that I didn't want to stop drinking, I can tell you that. It was that I didn't know how else to get myself to feel normal, or what I thought normal was. And really, that's kind of the idea of the scarcity loop. Fear, anxiety just took over. The thought of, I have to go back home to my empty house made me extremely anxious, or had to deal with life made me extremely anxious. I made the poor choice of drinking some more negative outcomes came. I went back to the hospital, and it just kind of feeds that way. And people do that with money. They do that with all sorts of different addictions. And it's because they're stuck in this loop of trying to regulate, trying to feel comfortable and to come down from the issues that they were triggered by. This all comes from this quote by Bruce Perry kind of sums up what we're talking about here. The repetitive issues around adverse childhood experiences, or the number of them, the repetitive issues around societal adverse community environments, the more repetitive in nature that these things are, the more likely someone is to develop a pattern of activation. It's the way their neural system develops, because when they're a baby, it's a pretty much a blank slate, and it just builds out from there. This is the basis of development, memory, and learning. And here's the thing. So we're learning as we're growing up whether the world is abundant or scarce. The thing about that is, if the world is abundant to a child, then the child also, because a child, a baby especially, their world, their prefrontal cortex isn't online, so their world is them. The world literally revolves around them. So if the world is abundant, then they're abundant, they're worthy. If the world is scarce, they feel literally like they are defective, or they are scarce, they aren't enough. So what we're talking about, everything we've been talking about to this point, is really about this ecosystem of adverse childhood experiences, adverse community environments, how they disrupt brain development for our children. And if you think about it, it doesn't mean we're not just talking about bad parenting, we're not just talking about things like that. We're talking about, also, how does discrimination, poverty, how do those things affect parents? How are the parents' experiences and their mental state, how are those things affecting their ability to connect with those children properly? As I mentioned, my mother had an undiagnosed mental illness. She literally, for multiple reasons, couldn't connect with me. Instead, I became something else to her, as opposed to having a bond or a connection in a more loving way. These types of things are what affect brain development to the point. As we've been talking about, everything that we've been talking about here is the biology of shame. Shame is not just a feeling. It's an intensely painful feeling. And I would say, in my experience, it's a lens that becomes how I view myself and the world. It's not that I've made a mistake, it's that I am a mistake. I am defective. And people start to walk through life feeling that they are defective, and that's from a biological sense. And I can tell you from experience how that looks. Developmental trauma is it's a very personal thing. And so, you know, as I talked about my experience with my parents, after a long, contentious period of trying to get custody of me, my father finally got custody of me, and I went to live with him. And I went from living in this very kind of poor white trash scenario to a scenario where, you know, my father and his wife had, they were well-educated folks. And so they had a really, and I was the only child there. So I went from a very poor, very chaotic type household to a very upper middle class, only child, not wanting for anything type of household. And that was very hard to adjust to. That may sound like a great fairy tale thing, but that's actually very, very difficult to adjust to. And kids, you know, unless they're walked through that more, will try to interpret how that looks for themselves. And for me, what I interpreted was that I had to put together a certain facade to be accepted, because all of a sudden I was in an upper middle class family that had money. And so in my interpretation of things, that meant that money was incredibly important and vitally important to how you were accepted into the world. And so I started to build my life around that thought process. And one of the other things that I had noticed, or started to, you know, not consciously and unconsciously build things around, was how to, you know, present myself as this successful person, not only in business, but in life. And so when I was in high school, I had actually come to the realization that part of what I was going to need to do to continue to build out my life was to be the greatest dad ever. I was going to have children of my own and become the greatest dad ever. And those children were going to become my validation that I am nothing like the people who raised me or the people that abused me. And so that's kind of, it sounds great on the surface a little bit, but if you really dig into that, that means I've already started my relationship with my son, my oldest son, before he was even born. In fact, in high school, I had his name picked out. I'd picked his name out, and I hadn't even met his mother yet. I hadn't met his mother until I was a sophomore in college. But I had his name picked out because he was going to be part of my identity and my validation. And this is part of how these things work. It's the relationships not only are the cause of developmental trauma or, you know, issues around brain development or lack of relationships, but relationships themselves become triggering in our own traumas and how we interact in the world. So, and this really played out once my son was born. At 30 years old, my son was born, and it was a very long birth. It was a 27-hour labor, and my ex-wife went through a lot. And so when he was born, she was unable to hold him for the first 24 hours due to some complications. And so that meant I had to feed him, and I had to hold him and rock him. And when they handed me him and when they gave me the bottle, I was excited. I was really happy to be there. But as soon as I looked in his eyes as I was feeding him, I went into a panic mode. My brain started to react, and part of that was just looking at this little boy and understanding this idea of unconditional love, which was not something that I was used to. It made me incredibly uncomfortable. My brain didn't know how to process it. My body didn't know how to process it. I literally felt like I wanted to crawl out of my skin. However, I will tell you that 6 years later, it was my connection to that little boy that really pulled me out, not only of my drinking, because after he was born, my drinking went through the roof. I started drinking at 175 of vodka a day, I felt horrible. I was in the scarcity loop. I was, feeling absolutely like a failure, and I was defective. I mean, here was this thing here's this thing that I had been waiting for my whole life, this person to help validate me, and I was having an impossible time playing with him, being with him. It was painful. So I would just drink, and it took 6 years of really learning how to stay uncomfortable. And time doesn't allow me to get into it too much, but it was really that power of reconnecting with him and being committed to that connection that helped me not only to stop drinking, but also started to challenge me more and more into what it meant to have loving relationships, thriving relationships, and authentic relationships in life. Relationships, I learned, are the oxygen of human development. These are the things that get us, as we've talked about already, they literally help us develop in our minds. They help our neural pathways connect to safety and to fully develop throughout our brain, so that our bodies can be wired to see the world as abundant. They also can be, if they aren't healthy relationships, if they aren't good, solid, nurturing relationships, they can do the opposite. But the good news is, and there is good news in all of this, is that it's relationships that can help change and literally change the biology of how we live. And it's in those relationships that we not only can be triggered for in negative ways, but we can also change and be triggered in positive ways and learn how and readjust to different ways of living life and getting through challenges and adversity. And one of the stories I use around this has to do with, the fact that I, lived the way I did and grew up the way I did. When I was in fourth grade, and this is more around the systems portion of it, my fourth grade teacher was very concerned about how I was falling behind in reading, how I was not performing well on the math tests, how I was not really performing up to the standards of the other kids in my class. And in that conference in fourth grade, she told my parents, my mother and stepfather, the two people who were abusing me, that she was afraid that I was slow, that I had cognitive issues, and that I wasn't able to keep up with the rest of the class. And this was in 1984. So there wasn't an ACE study yet. There wasn't this idea of trauma in the classroom. But really what she was doing is she saw one of her students, a student, who wasn't keeping up with the rest of the students. And we're trained in these things. We're trained to see folks in this way. And if you think about it, it's not seeing the humanity. It's not seeing the person. So I almost failed out of, I did very poorly in fourth grade, poorly in fifth grade. By sixth and seventh grade, when I was in middle school, I was almost held back actually in seventh and eighth grade because I would have such a poor attendance record. I just did not feel like going to school. And part of that was also the fact that I was going to school and being made fun of for being the poor kid who had the pink lunch ticket for free lunch and all of those things. So school wasn't exactly a very comfortable, safe place for me to be. It wasn't easy for me to concentrate and all of those things. But that teacher thought she was doing the best that she could for me because she thought there was something that needed to happen for me specifically, not realizing what I was dealing with on a day-to-day basis. You fast forward through middle school and I go into ninth grade, and I made a connection with one of my, a man who was a football coach for me and who also was one of my history teacher. And that connection, that bond that we formed from coaching and him being my teacher, that gave me confidence and made me feel safer at school. And I can't tell you any phrase or anything that he said to me specifically. It was just how he made me feel. He made me feel safe. He treated me like a human being. And I can tell you right now that that made all the difference in the world. By the end of that school year, my freshman year of high school, I had the highest grade in his history class. I also had a B average for the first time in my life. So this idea that I was cognitively impaired was not the case. What it was I just needed to feel safe so I could actually concentrate and perform in school. And that's what I'm talking about. He looked at me as a human being, not just as a student, as a number in his class who needed to meet certain marks. He talked to me as a person, was interested in what I was interested in. He was interested in helping me move forward, but in a way that was more relational and less, militant in you'd have to perform these tasks to get to a certain point. It was much more relational, and it literally was just the fact that he approached things that way. It made me feel safe, and I performed way better. I'm going to have to move around, but this kind of goes back to one of the theories that Bruce Perry really lays into. And Bruce Perry, if you don't know who he is, this is the second time I've referenced him, but he's a fantastic neuroscientist, and he really understands what is behind, what is truly behind relationships and how that affects our brain and how that helps us to regulate and to cope with life. And if we really want people to recover from trauma and thrive, relationships are the agent of change. They are the most powerful therapy we can give, and it's really just about loving. It really comes back down to how do we authentically love other folks. This quote by Pema Children, I use it because this is really where now we're going to focus on how do we get that to happen? How do we get to a point of that? Is, you got to look at your own darkness. I love the first line of this quote: compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It's a relationship between equals. Only when we know our own darkness can we really with the darkness of others. Compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity. This is important. This isn't just a saying, this isn't just a nice quote. This is vital because it is about, I can tell you from experience, it's about the human-to-human interaction. Relationship is 80% of healing. We know this. This is an established study. So we have to be able to be relational. We have to be able to be appropriately relational with people that we're trying to support, because I can tell you that from my experience, it was those relationships. They made me feel safe. They made me feel loved, and they made me feel like taking the risk to be able to then do the things that I needed to do that felt very scary, very terrifying, and very hard, like not drinking to regulate. But it was those relationships in my life that helped me to get there. And I can tell you that if you're going to do that with folks, you have to understand how to, when you're triggered. I mean, it really starts there. It's vital to understand what self-care is, and not just self-care, taking a day off here and there, but self-care in a very lifestyle protocol type manner. Self-care can't just be taking a couple of days off or going to the spa or changing your diet. Those are all things that can be part of a self-care protocol, but you also have to be very aware of your mental health. How are your emotions getting in the way? When are you being triggered? Because no matter how many systems we change, no matter how much we change from a systemic level, when it comes to supporting people, it's always the one-on-one relationship at the end of the day that wins out. So you have to be very aware of yourself and what's going on with you in order to be real support for folks. So that's why this work in understanding the biology of shame and how it affects us, understanding what self-care really looks like for us because we understand our own biologies of shame, that then allows us to implement an understanding of the people that we're working with, the people that we're working across from. So when we're talking about thriving, when we're talking about, what it looks like to get someone to thriving, it's all about relationships and it's all about authentic connection. That is literally our biological purpose in life, is to connect with people authentically so that we can feel safe and they can feel safe. We are a pack animal, and we really need to embrace that. Authentic connection and with the relationships with ourselves are where it has to start. If it can't start there, it is impossible to get real authentic relationships with other people. And so if you are aware of what's going on, if you start to dig into it from a real self-care protocol standpoint, then you're able to get to a point where you're able to work with folks on a human level. You have to be human to human with them. You can't be trying to help them, and you can't look at them like you're helpless. I can tell you this from experience as someone who's dealing with trauma. If someone comes at me and they're wanting to, quote unquote, help me, I'm going to shut down pretty quickly. If they are coming at me from a place where they look at me and say, I can't help this person, he's so far gone, I'm going to shut down. I'm not going to trust you. And it's really because it's all about them. It's about how they can, quote unquote, help me, or they can not help me. I need people to be at a relationship level so that I can trust them, feel safe with them first, and then be able to move on from there. As the story with my teacher, if we go back to that story, like I said, he did not do anything more than start a relationship with me. And that made all the difference. And so that's what we have to start looking at, is how can we look at a person sitting across from us as a human being and really get to understand what they've gone through so that we can get a better picture of who they are as a human being and as a person, because there is no such thing as a defective person. We are all just human beings dealing with human experiences. That is very real. There is no such thing as a defective person. We all have something to offer, and we all deserve to thrive. And I end on this slide, and I know I've gone through this very quickly, but there's a lot of information here, and usually there's a little more time to go through it. But to get to thriving, to me, again, has nothing to do with the job I have or the amount of money I make. It's the fact that I can love and be loved by these three individuals who make up my family. And that has led for me to have more authentic relationships and be more comfortable with other folks in my life.